So next up is a guy that has been here for, I think, everyone but two. He told me earlier today. Is that correct?
Pretty much.
He can tell you a lot about the things that he said right. Doesn't like to talk about the things he said wrong, which are very few. He's been a mentor of me since I got to NAU. Another really good guy, and glad to have him here for another event. Dr. Ronald Gunderson.
Welcome. Thank you, Wade. Welcome to everyone who's been here this year for the first time, as well as those of you that have been here many times in the past. I think those of you that were here last year will remember that it was just 2 days after the election and we were scrambling to get our presentations reworked because we weren't anticipating the outcome, to say the least. And at that time, I'm not sure what I thought it was going to be like, a year from now. I'm not sure hardly any of us knew what it was going to be like. But I know that a lot of Trump supporters said that this time, things were going to be different. This time, not only does the Republican Party control the presidency, but also both houses of the Congress. And this time, legislation's going to be flying off the desks and the tables, and immigration, deregulation, tax reform, all sorts of health care reform and so on. And all sorts of things were going to happen. So now, as we're a year later, what does it look like? Well, I think it looks much like it did in the past. Still this infighting, still things going on, and I'm not so sure that's going to change. I mean, it's part of our history that we've had these types of battles. In some ways, they're almost comical. If you look back 200 and some years ago, when you had the campaign of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, a very, very nasty campaign. And 28 years later, in 1828, between John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, the same thing. It was categorized or characterized a lot at that time, much like bathroom graffiti might be talked about today. That was pretty much how things were. And then if you go 100 years later to the late, I should say the early part of the 1900s, President Teddy Roosevelt was just finishing up his time in office, and as a big game hunter, he was about to go on an African safari and hunt big game. And J.P. Morgan, the big financier at that time, raised the glass and said, "America expects that every lion will do his duty." Clearly, they did not get along very well. Then 50 years ago, and I remember it well, it was the campaign in 1964, Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson, and the campaign slogan that Barry Goldwater was running on was, "In your heart, you know he's right." And Johnson's reply was, "And in your guts, you know he's not." So you had all kinds of things that were going on. You can always count on support for the British too. They always said that you can count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And what are we trying now? Well, we're trying trickle-down economics, and trickle-down economics is that warm feeling you get when those on top have your back. As you can see. So that's where we're at. Now let's see where we're going. And it's a long, slow road, right, to go up the hill. I'm not so sure still not so sure where we're headed, but I like to start with this chart, which is the broadest look at economic activity in a region, or in this case in the United States. And it's the real GDP, or the real gross domestic product. And this chart has 70 years of data here, and if you start with the very far right-hand side, where we are today, or at least since this is annual data, at least through 2016. You see that it's coming up a little bit. There's an upward trend there toward 2.5%. And if you look at the last 2 quarters in 2017, the GDP has been increasing, at 3 or slightly better than 3%, which hasn't happened for quite some time. And I don't think that for the year as a whole it's going to be 3%, but it's going to be very close. So we're kind of creeping up again. But the problem with this is, if you go back to the left-hand side of the chart in the late 1940s, you'll see that as you come out of each recession, the first half of that 70 years, the growth always reached about 7.5% coming out of the recessions. And the recessions, by the way, are those sort of slight or light gray vertical lines in the background there. And we've had 11 of those since the late 1940s. And the average increase, coming out was about 7.5% in the first half. And then if you look at the second half, it's not really reached even 5%. During that period of time. So the question is, why is that happening? And I'm not sure that economists have an answer yet. That is, we are in a position where we're either matured and we're not going to grow that fast anymore. Maybe it's globalization, maybe it's bad policy. The only economic factor I can think of is that median family incomes have been fairly stagnant in the last 20 years or so, which could contribute to some of this. Otherwise, as I've said before, we may be in a position where the U.S. was in a unique environment following World War II, where we were able to generate these high periods of growth for long, long periods of time. And those of us who were lucky enough, and many of us in this room were, to live through 2 generations of that increase, we may never see it again. That is, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren may never see that. It'll depend upon, how the economies, not only this one but others, change over the next several generations. So that's not such good news. On the other hand, for a more short-term period, one of the indicators that I do like to talk about is the Consumer Confidence Index. And that's put out every month by the Conference Board. Generally, if your number is above 90, it's considered to be pretty good. We were languishing in the 60s and 70s for a long, long period of time. By 2014, it had reached the 90s, and then it creeped up. And then this year, it's gone way up. It's gone up to 125, and I'm not so sure if we can pinpoint the exact cause for that. But I think part of it is that optimism that tax reform is going to pass, and that corporate taxes will be lowered and things like this. And when we get to the panel, we'll be talking a lot more about that. So I want to take the rest of my time here prior to the panel to look at some of the regional trends, things that are going on locally. And every year, or every month, the state of Arizona puts out job forecasts and job, not only forecasts, but the job market in general. And if you look at the chart here, the area in Mojave County in the western part of the state, which is called the Lake Havasu City Kingman Metropolitan Statistical Area, they led the way this year in terms of growth, in terms of growth from September of 2016 to September 2017, with just under 2.5%. Whereas the Phoenix area was just under 2%. The state as a whole, about 1.5%. Flagstaff and the Prescott metro areas were below the state average. We were about 0.6% increase here, and Prescott was about 0.3%. Tucson actually lost about 0.5% of the workforce over that 12-month period ending in September. So you can see it's kind of been a mixed bag around the state with regard to the job growth. But then if you look more at Flagstaff in particular, you can see how the revenue growth has changed in the Flagstaff area right here. And these numbers are preliminary because the state's been taking over the collection of data and the publication and so on, so it's sometimes not as timely as it may have been in the past, but they'll get that right sooner or later. But anyway, the total sales in the Flagstaff area, the taxable sales, were about up by 6% this year. So that's pretty good. It's not the double-digit increase that we saw maybe in some of the earlier years in the past. But 6% isn't bad. It's led by tourism, the BBB sector, although that number, even though it says 16%, that's a little high. Partly because of reporting differences. That is, there's been a change in requirements in terms of reporting sales tax for vacation homes and vacation rentals, and those things may have contributed somewhat to that increase. But a large amount of the retail in the area appears to be almost flat, only about 0.5% higher than what it was a year ago. And that may be something that is picking up a little bit now. I was thinking it should be a little bit higher than that. But at least these numbers are positive. They are increasing. And then if you look at the single-family home numbers, that has also been increasing by about 6%. These numbers are a little different from what you see in the newspaper because that data sometimes reflects just the city of Flagstaff alone. The numbers here reflect the Flagstaff area, including the unincorporated areas around the city on each side. So this is a little bit broader measure, and the numbers, some of you may have seen them before. I get them each year from the elite team at RE/MAX, Eric and Jessica, and thank you for those. And those numbers show, a little over 900 sales in 2015. It dipped a little bit in 2016, maybe just because of some things going on in the economy. I don't think that's a major blip there, because you can see most of those numbers have been growing up by about 10% a year, and this year, as I said, we're on track to get 6.5% higher than what we were before. So those things are on the upside, as are the single-family home prices. Now that's good, of course, if you're a seller or an owner of a home. The median price right now is about $410,000. In the Flagstaff area. You can see how it's increased every year since 2012, when it was under 300,000. So those numbers are also going up. And if you looked at the average prices, which are the mean prices, they'd be even higher. But I think the median is a better one to look at. Why is the housing expensive here, and why is it hard to find? Well, I think, as many of you know, getting workers in the construction and the trades industry is not easy. That is, we've had an extended period of time where it's very difficult to get a lot of younger people to enter the trades. And this has been on many of the national news items, and we've seen some of it locally, that just getting enough construction workers has been somewhat responsible for kind of the slow growth of homes. Many times real estate investors have been hanging on to the homes that they bought a few years ago. We thought we'd be putting them back on the market, and they've been hanging on to it. Also with the potential for rising interest rates, which others will talk about later on. That discourages some people from giving up their mortgage to buy a new home, because the new mortgage would be more expensive, and also the capital gains taxes are also standing in the way, because many times if you're retired, say you're a baby boomer, you'd like to move to another part of the country, you don't always get to do that if you're afraid of being hit with the capital gains tax. And that may actually become more of a problem depending on how things turn out with the tax reform issues that we'll be discussing later. But the growth is going to continue in Flagstaff. As you can see here, we've got population in 2010 and the projected amount between then and just 3 years from now in 2020. And I think we're looking at maybe an 11,000 increase in population over this decade in Flagstaff, as well as in the unincorporated areas, and then Sedona, Prescott, and the Mojave County cities as well, getting to be more and more people. So the last slide that I have before we go to the panel and hear the others first is that I think Flagstaff is in for a reasonably good year. It's not going to be a boom year. It's not going to be a double-digit year for growth or anything, but it's not going to be a depressed year either. That we're going to see some growth in the area between 6 and 10%. I think there could be some slowdown in tourism if the projected or proposed increase in fees to enter the national parks jumps from $30 to $70 per car, which is possible. That may or may not make a difference for a lot of travelers, but it sounds like a big increase, right? And it seems like it's a substantial increase, and it could deter some people from coming to the national parks, and of course that's a very important part of the Flagstaff economy. And then I always worry a little bit about construction. You look all over town, certainly there's quite a bit going on, but I think we may run into some bottlenecks there. So that's it for this part of the presentation. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in a few minutes.